Good morning. We'll give everybody a minute to keep filling in, but we have a tight agenda today, so we're excited to get rolling. Again, if you're just coming in, we're going to give you just a few minutes to let the rest of our attendees get in the room. And we'll get started for a full agenda right before lunch. So. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Our team at Abdo is very excited to again be joined with Julia Corbett from Blythe & Barons to talk to you today about some of the big ongoing and new changes yet to come related to employment law in Minnesota and some of the things that employers are going to need to really make sure we're ready for in the coming months. A couple housekeeping items. First, we do have a really full agenda. So trying to get through this content in an hour, we are not going to get to live questions during this session, but please feel free to chat in your questions. We'll get to as many of them as we can in the chat function within the webinar. Megan Schwann's a senior manager from our team who led a lot of the ESST initiative last year, will be answering as many questions as she can. The other important thing to note about that chat feature, if you see someone else that has asked a question that you're interested in hearing the answer to, feel free to thumbs up, upvote that question, so we'll make sure to get to the most pressing group questions. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat function. Let us know if you're having any audio, sound issues, and our team will help you with that. And then again, always a good reminder that all recordings, materials will be sent out after the session, as well as a short survey that we'd love your candid feedback. We're always trying to make these sessions as valuable and effective as possible for clients and attendees. So watch for that, but you will be getting a recording and slide deck. All right. So if you haven't joined us for our, I don't know, we really took this show on the road in 2023. So welcome back. But we're really happy to be here again. So again, I'm Leah Davis. I'm a partner at Abdo. I lead our workforce solutions team. We focus entirely on people-related issues with our clients, so HR and payroll. And I'm really excited to be joined today by Julia Corbett. Julia, if you want to introduce yourself.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Julia Corbett. I'm a managing partner at Blythe & Barons, a law firm here in Mankato. I'm the head of our employment group.
Thanks, Julia. Brenna Ramey's here again, senior manager from our team.
Wonderful. Happy to be here again today. I work with Leah on our HR and payroll team, and I'm really excited to be a part of this. Leah, I want to make one note on the Q&A and the chat items that if you put your questions into the Q&A box, they can be upvoted, and then a chat is for any technical or webinar issues, but that Q&A box, which is right to the left of the chat function, keep those questions in there because Megan will be living her best life answering those for you.
Yes, thank you. Don't put your questions in chat. Put them in the Q&A. Sorry, thanks for clarifying, Brenna.
Yeah.
And then Megan Schwann's another senior manager from our team. Megan, you want to give a quick shout?
Yes, yep. I'm senior manager here at the HR advisory team. And yes, as Leah said, I will be monitoring the chat and trying to answer those hot questions as fast as I can. Happy to be here today.
Great. And as we always say, there's nothing like kicking off a full agenda, like throwing in a little disclaimer, but I'm sure many of you understand in your roles that a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today can be very, very fact specific. And so we're going to give you as much information as we can in this 60 minutes, but if you have really specific questions, issues, concerns, you're going to want to make sure you're talking with your legal counsel about those to make sure you get the right answer. So our agenda today, we are going to try to knock out 3 of some really pressing and timely issues for employers right now. First, we want to talk about kind of, it's expected but unexpected when we were scheduling the webinar, but we do have some information and guidance we want to share with you related to the newly released FLSA salary threshold for exempt employees. So we'll talk through a little of that. We want to do a bit of a debrief on the Minnesota ESST post-implementation. What do we know now? What did we learn during the process? And what are the things we're still seeing presenting challenges for our clients and other employers? The last thing we want to touch on today is the Minnesota paid family leave. And this is something that feels really far away, but there are some very timely things that employers need to start thinking about. We have reporting starting this year, so we really want to make sure this is not getting pushed aside and that you really know what your, action plan is going to be for getting ready for this new big thing in Minnesota. So I am going to kick it over to Julia. We'd love to hear more about the FLSA salary thresholds.
Sounds good. It feels a little like deja vu with these salary threshold changes. And if you'll recall, several years ago, there was an attempt to change the salary threshold. And at the 11th hour, that was stopped. We are back again with a rule from the Department of Labor changing the salary threshold that will take effect currently on July 1, 2024. So about 6 weeks or so from now. So let's start first just with what hasn't changed. So the salary rule is about how much salary, I should say the new rule is about how much salary needs to be paid in order for certain employees to be exempt. Employees are exempt under any number of exemptions, some of which are controlled by the salary threshold rule, or it applies to those positions, and some of which it doesn't. This new rule doesn't change where the salary threshold applies or doesn't. So, for example, outside salespeople have been exempt and not subject to salary thresholds. Certain ag employees on the federal side have been exempt, not subject to salary thresholds. There are some differences for some public employees, police and fire primarily, in terms of their exemptions. Teachers have been exempt from the salary requirements, clergy, lawyers, doctors. There's a whole group of exemptions that are not subject to the salary thresholds. Nothing about that is changed by the new rule. So what hasn't changed is that for those employees that we call the white collar exemption, the executive, the administrative, the professional, the computer professional, and the highly compensated, they have to meet both a duties test and the salary test in order to be exempt. That's still true. So the duties tests haven't changed for those positions. They still have to be paid on a salary basis. What has changed is that amount of salary. So the salary test requires both that they be paid on a salary basis, which means, in a simplified term, they get a certain amount of money every pay period without deduction. There are some deductions that can be made, but they're few and far between. And so generally they're paid X amount per week, per pay period, and it's a steady amount. That's on a simplified basis, a salary basis. And then the amount of salary has to be equal to or exceed the salary threshold. So none of that has changed. What has changed, if I can move this, and I'm trying, we'll see. Somebody else did it for me, thanks. What has changed is the amount of salary. So currently, the salary threshold for those white collar exemptions is $684 a week, which translates out to $35,568 per year. So as long as employees in the white collar exemptions met the duties test, were paid on a salary basis, and were paid more or equal to or more than $35,568 per year, they were exempt. As I said before, what hasn't changed, they still have to have the duties test met, they still have to be paid on a salary basis, but now the amount is going up. And so as of July 1, 2024, that threshold's increasing to $844 per week, or $43,888 per year. Then it's going up again, January 1, 2025, increasing to $1,128 a week, or $58,656 per year. There's also some changes happening to the highly compensated employee thresholds. Highly compensated employees are sort of a hybrid. They have to meet one of the duties of the other exemptions, and then their salary can be made up of a combination of salary and incentive comp. But so it's a little bit more complicated than is laid out on this slide. But the bottom line is their total compensation as of July 1 will have to be $132,964. and it will go up January 1 to $151,164. Currently, it's about $107,000. So that one's going up about $30,000 a year by July 1 and about $50,000 a year by January 1. We're going to talk in the next slide about sort of what you need to be doing. But what I do want to say is what we saw last time is legal challenges. And because this is all moving so fast in terms of the implementation date of July 1, we're expecting legal challenges. And so you're going to need to start to get ready for these salary changes. But you're also going to need to keep your ear to the ground about legal challenges and whether a stop is put to it. We were talking yesterday, if we're recalling correctly, the last time I think the stop happened a day or two before implementation. It was very close to implementation date, and that could happen again. So you're going to sort of have to have your foot on the dock and in the boat. You're going to have to be, prepared to deal with the salary changes if there aren't legal challenges that stop it. But you're also going to have to be prepared. And I don't think you want to roll this out until July 1, because what we saw last time is people rolled out changes before the implementation date, and then it got stopped, and then they were stuck having made salary changes and trying to figure out what to do with it. So you're going to want to sort of be on a two-track system. And a lot of it will depend sort of on what boat you're in here. So if you don't know if your positions are exempt from a duties standpoint, if you don't know which positions are exempt as white collar exemptions in your organization, first step is figuring that out, do my positions meet the duties test for these exemptions? If you know all of that, if you've done a good job of auditing your positions and understanding why positions are exempt or non-exempt, then what you're going to need to do is review all of those white collar exemption salaries. So again, it's your executive, administrative, professional, computer, and highly compensated. If that person's salary is less than $43,888 per year, then by July 1, you're going to either need to adjust them to that salary threshold or convert the position to non-exempt. Now, you can continue to pay that person on a salary basis as a non-exempt employee, or you can start paying them on an hourly basis. But you are going to have to pay them overtime at 1.5 times for the overtime hours worked because they're now non-exempt. Then additionally, if that employee is going to be below $58,656 by January 1, you've got the same issue. And so my suggestion is you ought to be looking right now at both levels, because if you've got somebody less than $43,888 right now, so they're meeting the current salary, but they're not going to meet $43,888, you're going to have a decision to make about whether you raise their salary by July 1. But you also have a secondary decision to make about raising them to $58,000 on January 1. And if you're not willing to go to the $58,000, you might want to convert them to non-exempt now so that you're not having, well, we raised your salary July 1, and now we're converting you 6 months later to non-exempt. You're going to want to think that through to make sure that you've got a good employee experience. So those are the things that you need to be doing now. You need to be reviewing all of those exempt positions and starting to get ready for what your decision is going to be as to each person. Are you going to increase the salary, or are you going to convert them to non-exempt? When you convert to non-exempt, are you going to make them paid on an hourly basis plus overtime or a salary basis plus overtime? Either way, you got to pay overtime in excess of 40 hours worked if you're controlled by the Fair Labor Standards Act, the federal law. If changes are being made to exempt status and or salary amount, just remember that in Minnesota, the Wage Theft Act requires that any information on that employee notice that employees are provided at the start of employment, any changes to that have to be communicated to the employee in writing prior to the change occurring. So you're going to need, if you're adjusting salary by July 1, you're going to need a written notice to the employee about that salary adjustment. If you're converting them from exempt to non-exempt, you're going to need written notice about that. You don't have to completely redo your employee notices. You just need something in writing. And most of the time with salary changes, it's some kind of memo some kind of electronic notice within your electronic system about the change. So you don't have to completely redo your employee notices, but you do have to give written notice prior to the change. So prior to July 1, you're going to have to notify employees who are affected by this. If they're above $43,888 per year or $58,656, you're good. You don't have to do anything else if they're above that salary amount. All right, I think that covers this piece of it. So we'll move on and talk about Minnesota Earned Sick and Safe Time implications. And I've got the first part of this. So I'm going to start first with talking about some of the clarifications we've seen on the Department of Labor and Industries website. Some of those clarifications have caused confusion. Some have actually clarified. But we're going to start with those clarifications that we've received from the Department of Labor. Then we're going to move in and talk about sort of what both of our groups saw most of our clients doing in terms of the types of policies they adopted, and then the challenges that we're seeing now that things have been adopted and implemented and we're a few months into Earned Sick and Safe Time. And then we'll talk about some of the changes that are being proposed in the legislation before we move on to Minnesota paid leave. So let's talk about Department of Labor clarification. So first and foremost, the name of the policy does not have to be Earned Sick and Safe Time. And it doesn't have to be separate from an existing PTO policy. You can call it PTO, you can call it sick leave, you can call it Earned Sick and Safe Time, Earned Sick and Safe Leave, extended sick leave. One of my clients called it the blanking stupid leave in our conversation, not actually in the policy. The name of that policy does not matter. And it doesn't have to be named Earned Sick and Safe Time on the earnings statement either. All that matters is that the Earned Sick and Safe Time rights are within a policy. What I generally recommended to my clients who don't have an Earned Sick and Safe Time policy, it doesn't have that title, that somewhere in the policy, it says something like eligible employees, let's say it's a PTO policy. There would be language in that PTO policy that says, eligible employees under this policy receive their Earned Sick and Safe Time under Minnesota law through this PTO policy. So it's very clear to anybody looking at it, I'm aware of Earned Sick and Safe Time, and I'm giving you the rights. And then the PTO policy needs Earned Sick and Safe Time language built into it, et cetera. So you have to build in the rights and you have to follow the statute, but you can call it whatever you want to call it. And the same thing can be on your earnings statement. So if you put everything in PTO, that's fine. Your earnings statement can reference PTO. So that was one of the early clarifications. There's a clarification that I think creates confusion. The Earned Sick and Safe Time statute says that an employee currently says that an employee is anyone who works in Minnesota for 80 hours. So that's your definition of employee. It also says that employees begin to accrue the Earned Sick and Safe Time immediately at the start of employment. And then it says employees can use Earned Sick and Safe Time as it's accrued. So there's some confusion about, can you force them to wait 80 hours to use it, or do you have to let them use it right away? And you're going to get different opinions on this. Okay, so talk to your own legal counsel. But what I generally have been telling my clients is the definition of employee is somebody who's worked for you 80 hours. And then it says employees can use Earned Sick and Safe Time as it's accrued. So if you back it out and say, replace employee with the definition, persons who've worked for you for 80 hours can use it as it's accrued. So my position has been that they have to start accruing it on day one, but you can limit usage of Earned Sick and Safe Time until they've worked for you for 80 hours. And if you put it in PTO, some of my clients then put restrictions on, you can use ESST, you can use PTO for ESST reasons after 80 hours, but if you want to use it for vacation or just personal time off, you can't do that for 90 days or 6 months or whatever that might be, because they were concerned about large PTO banks being used early in employment. So that's a clarification on the Department of Labor and Industry website that I think creates confusion. Leah's going to talk about some changes to the statute that are out there proposed, and one of them I think would change it so that employees can use it immediately. And I think they recognize that it's still confusing and it's not clear and it probably doesn't say what they intended. So we may see a change to that one. Exempt employees accrue based on a presumption of 40 hours worked per week unless there's clear evidence the work week is less than that. Again, I generally, if we have an accrual policy for an ESST, I generally like language in there that says exempt employees will accrue based on a 40-hour work week. The third clarification is that ESST can be calculated and shown in the same manner as your other payroll practices. I think there was confusion with the 1 hour for every 30 hours worked and how you had to show that and calculate it. Were you having to calculate every 30 hours and somehow show it to employees? And you're not required to do that. So you calculate it, you show it. If your earnings statements come every 2 weeks, that's when it's going to be shown on their pay stub and calculated in that manner. It may be that your systems are actually calculating it, though, 1 hour for, they should be, if you're doing the accrual, 1 hour for every 30 hours work. And if an employee asks for the time off, it is available to them to be used. It's just a question of how you're showing it to them on your payroll practices. If an employee works out of Minnesota, but works at least 80 hours in Minnesota, earned sick and safe time does not need to accrue on hours worked outside Minnesota. So if you have sort of a hybrid employee, maybe they're working remotely from Wisconsin, but they're here a couple of weeks a month, they are going to only accrue ESST time on their hours worked in Minnesota, not on their hours worked in Wisconsin. Employers cannot tell employees to find their earned sick and safe time information in the timekeeping system. It must be on an earnings statement provided to the employee. Again, that's a proposal for change in the new legislation, which I think would be tremendously helpful. If you're writing to your legislators, complaining about this, this is one that would be helpful to you, this piece of that new statute. But currently, you can't tell them your ESST is in the timekeeping system. That created a problem with what we thought we could do initially, what Leah and I kind of call the bucket within the bucket of PTO. Initially, we thought, well, we can have these big PTO policies and say somehow we're segregating 80 hours or 48 hours for earned sick and safe time and in that bucket. The problem is showing that on the earnings statement and how you show that on the earnings statement. And I think the way the statute is written right now, that's very difficult unless you have a payroll system and earnings statement that can show all of this breakdown, PTO and the bucket within the bucket. And I personally don't have a single client that had a payroll system that could do that. Some of them had HRIS systems where it could do it, but that's not enough. It's got to be on an earnings statement that's going to the employee. And then employees paid by stipend and presumed to work more than 80 hours per year are eligible for ESST. So that's the other clarification there. Last slide on this. If you front load earned sick and safe time, you can prorate hours for part-time so long as the total amount is the amount required under the front loading option. So let's say you wanted to front load 80 hours, and that was going to be your policy for your full-time employees. You can't front load 40 hours for part-timers because they're below the requirement. So if you're going to prorate, the prorated amount has to be at least or in excess of the 48 or 80 hours. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, shoot that to Megan and she'll clarify. You also can't prorate front-loaded hours for a partial year. So if you were doing a front-loaded PTO or ESST, if you were front-loading ESST and you hired somebody in December, let's say you were doing an 80-hour front load as your ESST program for your employees, and you're hiring somebody in December. So you want to say, well, can I just give them 1/12 of 80 hours and front load that on December? And then I'll front load the other 80 on January 1 if you're doing a calendar year. And the answer to that is no, you cannot prorate. You have to, if you're going to front load, you've got to front load the full amounts. The workaround for that is to do an accrual for the first partial year of employment and then front load at the start of the next benefit year. So for that example, if you're front loading 80 hours on January 1st of each year and you hired somebody in December, you'd do an accrual for the first partial year. So they'd earn 1 hour for every 30 hours worked. And because they're allowed to roll that over and up to 80 hours, if you're doing an 80-hour front load, All you have to do is front load up to 80 hours on January 1. They've got their 80-hour bucket and you're good. So if you did a front load system where you have some sort of proration in the first partial year, that would be incorrect and should be adjusted. It should go to accrual during the first part of the year, or you just got to give them the whole bucket, 80 hours on December 1st, knowing they can work 80 hours for you and then they've got 80 hours off for sick and safe time in that month if they need it. And then currently, if a PTO policy or other leave policy, it doesn't have to be PTO, is as generous as what is required by earned sick and safe time law, even if the employee uses all the PTO for vacation or personal, it still meets the requirements. You don't have to make them hold 80 hours, or you don't have to hold 80 hours for them. If you give them 200 hours of PTO and they take 200 hours of vacation and then get sick, that's kind of their problem. Not kind of their problem. It's their problem. It's not your problem. As long as you've given them the hours and it's complied with earned sick and safe time, if they choose not to use it for earned sick and safe time and it's gone when they need it for that purpose, that is not your problem as the employer. All right, I think we're on to the next slide, which I think is to Brenna.
It is, yes. Thank you, Julia. Well, and I'm sure all of you are kind of sitting there spinning your heads around. And so what we wanted to do today was talk a little bit about, we've had all these learnings, we've had all these challenges. And so the questions that all of us are getting, Megan, Leah, myself, Julia, and all the other people on our both of our teams, is what is everybody else doing? So how do I solve it? What are the solutions that I can do with that? So what we've done is between the four of us, and again, Megan has really been kind of the, I would say, the funnel of all of this stuff on the Abdo team, said, what are the bulk of people doing? So we've just got a real quick rundown of what most clients and most organizations are doing when it comes to their ESST strategies. This is both public and private. So like Julia said, a lot of people are actually doing essentially what she's recommended here, which is they're doing this front loading option, but they're not for the first year. So they have two separate policies. One is for maybe you're hired today. So you're hired on May 15th of 2024. From May 15th of 2024, you're going to accrue ESST hours. And then at the calendar year, January 1st of 2025, in this case, you would be front loaded and you wouldn't have to front load above and beyond what that minimum standard is, right? You'd follow the rest of your policies. So we have a lot of people doing that. We have a lot of people who have very separate ESST policies for part-time, seasonal, temporary, and they've really separated out who are those full-time regular employees, what is their policy, and then what is everything else. And I think that has been where we've seen a lot of wins when it comes to employers being able to have options when they're saying, hey, we're happy, we're fine with our full-time regular employees having this 200 hours of PTO that meets the ESST standard. We just don't want our part-time employees to have that same amount because then they would never be here. So you can have those separate policies. An umbrella over all of this, which is, I think, the drum that all of us are hearing and we're all beating with our clients, is what are the challenges you see in your workplace outside of ESST? Do you see chronic attendance and abuse issues, right? Do you see chronic calling in without notice? Do you have chronic, I'm calling in and my shift started 10 minutes ago because I overslept? Do you have high turnover in those positions? And it's those issues that you were dealing with before ESST that are driving your decision-making when you're looking at those ESST policies. Again, we've seen a lot of that extended sick leave bucket, right? So you're creating a separate bucket for that ESST. We have a lot of clients who have said, hey, we're going to take PTO and we're going to keep that in one bucket. And then we're going to have this separate sick bucket, which is ESST. But that really comes down to what did that usage look like beforehand and what were those challenges? So I know I've been seeing the number of Q&A be ticking up a lot with Megan. So I love, if you have specific questions about that, we would love for you to go in there. Again, you'll get a copy of the slide that really talks about what are your options. And as a reminder, we talked about this a lot as clients were rolling this out going into 2024. And a reminder that if the program that you put in place for 2024 is not working for you, you're not stuck for life. You can say, this didn't work. This caused a lot of either administrative challenges, or it caused staffing challenges. Our managers didn't understand it. We didn't understand how this was actually going to impact us. That you can adjust that. You can change that. You always have the ability to do that, as long as you're following the Department of Labor's guidance about you're not taking away hours that they've already earned, and you're meeting those minimums of 48 and 80. And if you have specific questions on that, reach out to your HR or legal partners, because you're going to want to be really consistent in how you handle that. But you can go back and change what you've currently been doing. So I know we're going to go into some challenges. Leah is going to be our moderator and shoot some questions at us. And really what we've got here is just common questions that we've all seen over the last 6 months.
Yeah, great. Okay, so teeing that up, like you said, clients are in it. They're living in the world of ESST, and here's what we're facing in real life. Here are the questions that we continue to bump into. So Julie, I'm going to kick this one to you. What should employers with unlimited PTO or employers considering unlimited PTO be thinking about?
Yeah, so first off, I don't love the use of the word unlimited, and I didn't change the slide, and I should have. I like to call them flexible PTO policies, but essentially what those are, if you're not familiar with them, is we're not going to give you a number of hours. You're sort of expected to get your work done and then take the time off that you need to deal with your personal life, your sickness and illness, vacation needs, etc. And there's usually still parameters around it in terms of expectations and those kinds of things. But they're most common, I would say, in managerial level employees, white collar professional roles. We don't see it as much in blue collar workforces, line level employees. But one of the things, because this is a more generous policy than earned sick and safe time, right? It's allowed as long as it complies with earned sick and safe time. So for my clients who have these flexible PTO policies, again, I recommended building in language that you're getting your Minnesota earned sick and safe time under this. I also recommended language that basically said, look, you're guaranteed to have 80 hours in a year to use for these purposes, because that's the minimum requirement without paying something out, right? If you're front loading. And so with flexible, there's kind of nothing to pay out. There's no bank. Nobody's tracking the hours. And so we built into those policies the earned sick and safe time usage reasons and the protections and all those things, and basically said, look, you're still on unlimited or flexible PTO, still use it for what you need to. You're expected to get your work done. You're expected to report when you're gone, all the things that were already in there. And then we added some language that, we're going to guarantee you that you can use at least 80 hours of this for earned sick and safe time. Then employers had a decision to make. Are they actually going to track that? Or are they just going to let it go? And if there appears to be abuse, then deal with it. And so far, all of my clients who have flexible, I have not heard from one of them that they want to make a change. That those employees who were able to manage flexible PTO before without a problem are still managing it the same. I think if you had flexible PTO and you were seeing abuse, what you'd probably do is change your flexible PTO to be for vacation and personal time off, and then add an earned sick and safe time policy that was more strict around those hours, and leave flexible PTO for vacation and personal time if you had abuse in it. But you can easily do earned sick and safe time in a flexible PTO policy. It just requires some language around it.
Great. I think this is one of the big concerns we heard from clients last year. And now in some situations, they're seeing this, right? You alluded to this a little bit, Brenna, but how should employers be thinking about managing chronic abusers when it comes to
I would say
paid time off?
Yeah, I would say that this is the most common issue I've had come up since ESST went into effect. That I bet all of us could say in any given week, we get at least one client who says, I've got a chronic abuser of ESST that's impacting my ability to run my organization. We can't get our work done. It's frustrating other people. What do we do? And the answer to this is that if you are tracking your ESST hours specifically, it really gives you a clear path forward on what to do that. So let's say, for example, we have on here the first bullet example. I think this is actually a specific question that we've all gotten probably 150 times in the last, since January 1st. What if an employee only has 2 hours of ESST and they want to take 8 hours off? And let's say those last 2 hours of ESST exhausted everything and they've had lots of attendance issues, but using ESST. You can count the remaining 6 hours of that that absence under your regular attendance policy. And so what I would tell you is that the way to manage chronic abusers is to have a clear attendance policy that you can fall back on when those absences are no longer covered under ESST. So let's say you have somebody who is trying to game the system a little bit and they're trying to take advantage of it. That's not the average employee, but we know those exceptions exist. And they're calling in and using an hour of ESST for each full day absence, thinking that protects the whole entire day of absence. And the answer is it does not. It protects that hour of ESST. So ESST is accrued or front loaded, but tracked in hour increments, meaning that if they don't have enough hours, that whole day is not tracked. The other thing is that if somebody has those ESST absences and they're using that time and they're really accruing some excessive behavior, once that ESST is gone and they've used it all, again, you're rolling right back into your attendance policy where you're saying, well, now those ESST hours are gone. And so we need to be able to track those. The other thing that we're seeing a lot of is, well, what if they only have 2 hours of ESST? Let's use that 2 and 8 example again. They have an 8-hour shift and they only have 2 hours of ESST. ESST is clear that if you use ESST for an absence, that the employer cannot require them to find coverage for their shift. We see this a lot in home healthcare employers and retail and hospitality and food and beverage. That standard would be you have to find somebody to cover your shift. So for those 2 hours of ESST, you can't require that, but you can for that 8-hour time frame. So if they have that 8-hour shift, 2 hours of ESST, so there's 6 hours remaining, you can require them to find coverage for that 6 hours, that remaining shift for 6 hours. So you really want to be looking at this when it comes to ESST and managing chronic abusers, down to the detailed hours, not necessarily the shift. So be looking at those hours. And Leah, could I just jump right into this next question? Because I think it actually ties into this chronic abuser system. All of these tend to overlap with this question. And that third question that's right below this one is, can I require people to use ESST hours for absences? What if they didn't ask for it? How does that work? And the reason I want to tie these two together is this. You cannot require somebody to use ESST hours for an absence. You cannot say, hey, you haven't used ESST yet and you have a bank available. I'm going to require you to use it so you burn through it. This is a common question when they're having everything all together, right? So can I use those first 48 hours they're gone for the year and call it ESST, or 80 if they front loaded without that payout? No, you cannot. You cannot require them. What you can do is, let's say Leah calls in sick to me. It's impossible because I'm not her employee. She's actually my boss. Fun fact. So I would be calling into her. But in this scenario, Leah calls into me and says, Brenna, I can't come in sick. I'm not going to come in today. I'm sick. I'm not going to be able to make it in. And Leah can say, wonderful. Thank you for letting me know. You do have 48 hours of ESST available to you. Are you going to be using those hours, ESST hours, for this absence? And I say, nope, I don't want to use them. She can say, great, well, you do have PTO available, so I will be taking this out of your PTO hours then. Or if I don't have anything available, maybe I've already used all my PTO, or in a lot of cases, this happens with no one's accrued PTO yet, right? So they haven't earned it in their first year. Leah can say, well, if you don't use your ESST hours, because you don't have PTO hours, this would be considered an unexcused absence and will be addressed under our attendance policy. And then the employee can say, oh, just kidding. I want to use my ESST hours. You say, great, wonderful. I will take these 8 hours out of your ESST policy. Just as a reminder, you only have 6 hours left, after which case we're going to roll into our attendance policy. So the reason I want to tie these two together is that if somebody is calling in and doesn't want to use their ESST hours or only wants to use 2 of them, you can remind them, well, if you're only using 2 ESST hours, The other 6 hours of your shift will be addressed under our attendance policy, in which case this will be, maybe it's the third step, maybe it's the first step, and you need to get coverage for the 6 hours of your shift. So again, really what this comes down to is having good policies. Do you have good attendance policies that are clear when you're not using ESST hours, what the process will be and how you will address that? And again, that comes back down to good communications. We're going to kind of end this ESST section on what do you need to teach your managers on and train them and equip them on. And this comes down to somebody saying, do you want to use your ESST hours? Are you using ESST? Are you using PTO? Or is this an unexcused absence because you don't have either of those to cover that?
Yep. And I want to drive this home one last time because this fourth question is related, but let's hit it one more time. Julia, can employers force employees to designate the first 48 hours of PTO each year as ESST?
The answer to that, I think, is pretty clearly no. I've seen a number of policies. I think early on, again, we thought we could sort of do this bucket within the bucket and make that work. And I don't think you can make that work under the current status of the statute, if at all, very easily. So I've seen policies that say you have 200 hours of PTO. The first 48 hours are gone, or the first 80 hours are gone. We're going to count towards the ESST. You cannot do that. So if you're giving it in a big PTO bucket, whatever they're using it for is probably going to be protected by the ESST rules, which is why some employers chose to break out ESST out of their PTO because of that reason. You cannot force it. The other thing I would just comment, going back to chronic abuse, if you don't have a call-in policy in your attendance policy, you should get one. Both for if you're large enough to have FMLA, or if you're not and you're just subject to ESST, you can discipline for failure to follow call-in policy. So if you have a call-in policy that says you need to call in absences 30 minutes before your shift, 60 minutes before your shift, those two are probably reasonable. 24 hours before your shift might not be, but if you've got a reasonable call-in policy and that employee is not following it, you can discipline on the basis of not following the call-in policy. You're not disciplining because they're using ESST. You're disciplining because they're not following call-in. Now, you're going to have some flexibility around that. My example to every one of my clients was if a employee's on his way into work and pulls over and vomits outside the car, and they're 5 minutes from work, they're not going to follow your call-in policy, and you're going to have to be flexible on that. Now, if that happens 30 times, you probably can start dealing with it maybe at time 5 or 6, right? So you're going to have some flexibility, but those call-in policies can really help you. So if you don't have one in your attendance policy, you want to consider getting one. All right. I think we'll move to the next one, and I think it's mine. I'm getting a lot of questions about, this employee wants to be gone for this reason and wants to use ESST. My sick pet, I need to take my dog to the vet. I have a funeral to attend. I have, name a reason that isn't in ESST, and employees will say they want to use it. Now, you can technically allow its use beyond what it's required to be used for. You can allow that, but you're not required to. And so I think the big key is hopefully your policy has in it, here are the ESST usage reasons. And there's kind of a short list on the DOL site. I don't love that short list. I like the longer list from the statute because it's much more detailed and helpful, I think, to supervisors than the general 5 bullet points in the DOL list. So we can pull the actual list from the statute and get it to your supervisors. These are the reasons they can be gone and use ESST. That helps to make the answer to, can I use it for my sick pet, pretty easy. I think maybe we answered the second one already here in terms of, Brenna answered that earlier.
Yeah. And then last one is related to manual ESST accrual calculations. And I can probably speak to this one. So we're hearing, or I'm still seeing employers that for one reason or another, they couldn't get their time and attendance and or their payroll system to automate the calculations. And they're still doing sort of external calculations outside of payroll, which then if you're following the statute means you have to import that information back into the payroll system so that it's showing up on pay stubs appropriately. I think that's still an area where I guess my main takeaways for employers would be, you shouldn't need to be doing that. Nearly every payroll system should provide some accommodation to allow this accrual. You know, even if it's just, we're gonna accrue this much for every hour worked, most systems, even for very small employers, should do that. But if you're not using a sophisticated payroll calculation system, and I mean, you may need to consider an update if that's something you want to automate. But I think it's just sort of fraught with opportunity for issues and errors, and the pay stub reporting continues to be a challenge. So I think that's still an area that hopefully, if I can say anything, invest the time in that automation and it will pay off in time saved. So get over that finish line if you haven't yet and get that automated. Julia and Brenna alluded to, and I can kind of take this on, but like what's probably still to come. Some things that I'm concerned about, a lot of the work I do tends to be on the technical compliance and some of the more payroll time related issues, system setup. I do believe there's going to be some hiccups in the rollover to 2025, right? So I've seen lots of policies that are set up in automated systems where they've got the year 1 hours accruing correctly, but that the rollover limits aren't set up correctly. So I think big takeaway, plan to do an audit of the calculations and rollover after your first payroll in 2025, just to make sure that nobody lost hours, that there wasn't sort of a carryover limit that wasn't appropriate, those types of things. I'm seeing lots of policies set up with a max limit of 48. Well, that's the yearly accrual limit, but the max balance accrual is 80, depending on how you have your policy set up if you're not front loading. So really keep an eye on that rollover. And then we mentioned, but there's a couple bills running through, probably only one that has any chance of making it through, just because of the way because of the political structure and control at the Capitol. But I think employers need to be prepared for some potentially good administrative updates, things like maybe we don't need to have the pay statements show the information if the employees can easily access it in another system like Time or their employee self-service. We're seeing some clarity proposed about potentially this whole, they can use it in any increment tracked by the payroll system. They might clarify that to be a quarter of an hour so that we're not dealing with 0.1, 0.05, whatever. But there are some maybe less employer-friendly things in the proposed bills. And again, these can change so much. Session is scheduled to close next week, so we will know more about what the final word on some of this is next week. But I mean, there are some things on the docket that won't be as great if they make it through. There's a broadening definition of employee. There's some changes potentially to calculations. I think, Julia, is it still proposed that employees could use ESST for bereavement leave?
Yeah, I was just going to say, it adds funeral attendance, et cetera. So if that happens, it might mean employers get rid of their bereavement leave policy, because that expansive list of family member means these people are going to be able to be gone using ESST for, any number of things, or they might modify their bereavement policies. If you're out of ESST, we might give you more time depending on your policies. The other thing that I think that is confusing in there, and I'm actually going to reach out to my senator when we hang up today. There's a section on, it says there's no effect on more beneficial policies, but that language basically says that you can have a more beneficial policy as long as all of the hours for personal sick comply with ESST. So if you did a PTO policy or an extended sick bank, so I had a number of clients do an ESST policy that was pretty tight so that they could control, they can't get documentation for 4 days, it's protected, it's subject to all the ESST, maybe only 80 hours of that is ESST. And then employers did an extended sick bank where we can ask for documentation whenever, they had bigger sick banks, but they wanted to keep some control over the bigger portion of it. Under the way this is written, it looks to me like all of that would now be subject to ESST. So my question is, why would an employer ever give more sick time than they're required to if you're going to attach all these strings to it? So I'll be writing to Senator Frentz when we hang up today about that, because some of this stuff in this statute I think is beneficial. That one particular issue, I think it just doesn't even make any sense to me. So we'll know more in a week.
Yeah, keep your eyes and ears out. I think
You've got time to write to your legislators. Take a look at it and take a look at the House file and the Senate file and write to your legislators. Might be on deaf ears, but it doesn't hurt.
Yep, great. And keep your eyes open because there will likely be some updates that you're going to need to watch for.
Can I steal 1 minute?
Yes.
See how fast you can roll, Julia? We've got a couple questions that were voted up. So we have a consolidated PTO plan that is more generous than ESST law. In the past, we had required the use of PTO during a leave. Is this still permitted under an inclusive PTO plan? To exhaust?
I believe so,
PTO?
yes. I believe so, yes.
Okay. And then the second one is related to FLSA that quite a few people have voted up. We have a few employees that are what we call regular full-time and are only working 32 hours a week. If they are to remain exempt and salary, is there a table to use for 20% less wage?
Oh, that's a really good question, and we get it a lot. The answer is you cannot prorate below that number. So there is no table. I don't have the slide up on the numbers, but if you have somebody, we had an example the other day, if the salary was like 52,000 and you had somebody working 0.9, could you prorate that salary to 0.9? And let's assume that would take it to 47,000. I don't do math in my head very well, but I'm sort of trying to recall the numbers we were working with the other day. So prorating it to 0.9 would take it to 47,000. That would be below the salary threshold as of July 1. That would not be compliant and that person would no longer be exempt. So if the salary's 60,000 and you want to prorate to 0.9, you're okay because you're above the salary threshold. Assuming 0.9, yeah, 0.9 would be above the 48. But you have to be above that salary threshold in order to have the person be exempt. So if you have somebody who's only working 32 hours and you want to do a 0.8 on the number on the salary for the full-time, and you want to do a 0.8 on that salary has to be above those minimums or that person has to be converted to non-exempt. Mm-hmm. That's a really good question and one we've dealt with a lot. So thanks for bringing that up.
And I think we've seen people do, if you want to keep them salary non-exempt, they need to track their hours though, because if they go over,
if they're only working 32, there's not a lot of risk on that because they're never going to get to overtime. So you could keep them salaried at 0.8 of the full-time, convert them to non-exempt, just know that they have to track their hours. And if for some reason in a work week they got over 40 hours, you're going to have to pay them overtime because they're not exempt anymore because their salary is below that threshold.
Hey, Julia and Leah and Megan, I'm going to zip us on to paid leave just because I have just under 8 minutes to get through all of that content. So I want to make sure we let the group walk away. So maybe I can just say you're going to get this slide that's up for training your managers. You probably heard us say a lot today. The real challenges is actually the supervisors not understanding all these things. So really making sure your managers are trained in. We're going to zip by this just again so we can really stay focused in getting you the Minnesota paid leave information. So let's jump into Minnesota paid leave. I want to give a kind of 20,000 foot view reminder that paid leave in Minnesota goes effect January 1st of 2026. It is not going to act like in-house FMLA currently does. And a reminder that it will act more similar to unemployment. It'll be governed by the agency. This is all through deed, which is where unemployment currently goes through in Minnesota. This is going to be a new department in the agency, and it will be approved and paid. So anybody eligible for paid leave will be approved by the state agency and paid by the state agency, unless you do a private plan. Set that aside for the minute. So there's a lot on this slide. We don't love doing that, but the reason we put all of this content on this slide is that you're all going to get it, and we want you to have it in one place. So actually just less than 2 weeks ago, Deed sent out an update. We were kind of crossing our fingers when we scheduled this that we'd get it all by then, because they had said we'd get an answer, and we did. So this actually slide I think is great news, in that it's preparing you for what's going to come. If many of you remember that reporting, wage detail reporting had to start in 2024. The first one you can see on the 4th bullet down is that the first wage detail reports are due October 31st of this year, so of 2024. What's great news is that if you currently have the UI, you can see that's unemployment insurance account with Minnesota, you don't have to do anything different. You will get a notice from the state saying, hey, it's ready for you to create an account, but it's just going to be tied to your unemployment insurance account. When you submit your unemployment insurance wage detail report, it will be that one report that goes to both of those accounts. That's great news. If you don't currently have one, you will need to create an account with the state of Minnesota. The sentence there that says this account will be available in the spring is the exact language from the Deed communication that came out. So I think we're going to see a lot more information that comes available, and I think it's going to be quiet, and then it's going to be real quick. We're going to get a bunch of information from Deed that will tell you what you need to do. So kind of keep your eyes and ears out. If you are not already set up to do this, if you go to the Minnesota Deed website, you can click on there's like a little account that says, hey, I'm interested in getting emails related to anything about Minnesota paid leave. If you select that and put your email address in, you will get notices directly from the state telling you, hey, it's now open. You can go on and create your account for the Minnesota paid leave. It's very simple to do. The one thing I want to make sure we clarify, because we are getting this question a lot, is that in 2024, you're redoing wage detail reporting. There is no premium payments happening until 2026. So no employer will have to pay anything until 2026. Everything before that is just wage detail reporting. Okay, so if we zip on to the next slide, we're going to talk about things to think about. Many of you might have heard this already. I'm going to guess a lot of you have not heard any of this already. And Leah's going to talk about the implications, because we've seen this happen in Massachusetts and Washington. But what needs to be on your radar now is the private insurance option. So when this legislation was passed, it said, hey, you have to either do the state program or you can have your own private plan. What we've seen happening already starting in Minnesota, and actually a couple of us from the Abdo team have sat in on meetings with insurance brokers and agencies, talking to clients about, hey, the great news is we're going to come up with a private plan. You don't have to create this on your own employer. You can, instead of having short-term disability, through your insurance agents, can actually elect to have this private plan. So what we wanted to give you was a list of questions that you could bring back to your broker, your agent, whoever it is, because we don't actually have answers to this yet. These questions are these 3 bullets right underneath there. So again, I know we're going real fast on this. I just want to make sure that we're getting all this content in for you. But you want to be talking about, okay, in the state program, if somebody applies for Minnesota paid leave, it's going to be the state agency who's approving that they're qualified, and then is calculating how much they will be owed back. Under a private plan, you're going to want to say, okay, who's making that determination? Who's determining if somebody is eligible for state leave? And if that determination is wrong and an employee files a claim, who's accepting that liability? Is my insurance agency that I'm getting this private plan through, or is that coming back to the employer? We want to talk about how is the agency going to handle premium increases. So one of the fun facts that's not fun that you're going to take out of here today is that when the legislation was passed, the premium was 0.70. That's what it's going to be. We right away within months had an outside auditor that was part of the program come in and say, hold the phone, that's actually not going to be enough money. They already just this week, Leah did some research last night, and they're already saying, as of today, if the program went live, it would have to be a 0.99 premium.
0.88.
Sorry, 0.88. Thank you. 0.88 premium. That's going to have to go. The likelihood that will increase by 2026, I think, is very high. We don't, we can't crystal ball it, but I think we could in this case. So the question is then to your insurance carrier, who's going to handle those premium increases? On the state side, there are caps on that. Is there a cap on the private? So you just want to ask these questions. Again, we don't have answers because that's going to be for your insurance agent or broker. Leah, rapid fire, because we still have a whole nother slide to go. Rapid fire, what are the implications for Massachusetts and Washington that I think we want to talk about, and then those large banks that people have?
Yeah, key takeaway, employers now need to, especially in the public sector where they've sort of got these historical large sick leave banks and some local government settings, start thinking about what those banks are for. Your councils, the constituents are going to start asking, why do we have a 900-hour sick bank at our city if employees don't have to use it anymore for extended sick leave, right? So and a lot of those have payout provisions. So employers need to start thinking about, what am I going to do with my existing short-term disability policy? Do I need this large of an extended illness bank or sick bank? And really also HR teams need to start thinking about how they're going to manage federal FMLA and Minnesota paid family leave, knowing that the leave requirements and eligibility, that's not necessarily going to run concurrently. So there could be multiple schedules rolling there. At the end of the day, Massachusetts and Washington. So our leader of this program came from Massachusetts, the man leading the Minnesota program. There's not enough staff to cover the demand. Is really, long story short, they're struggling with long wait times, struggling to get approvals, get payments in a timely fashion. So I think that's probably something we're going to need to just be prepared for.
Great. Okay. So last thing, nothing on this slide is new. So the good news is that we're flying through it. We'll keep talking here. If you need to drop off, remember that you're going to get a recording of this. So you can fast forward through us at hyperspeed and just listen to the last couple of minutes. If you have a meeting you need to get to, we're going to keep going because this is valuable and important information. But here are the things. If you walk out of here today, there's 3 things you need to do, and just remember the fourth. The fourth is that everybody's a little bit stressed about what is that wage detail reporting going to look like. We know it's fine. Everybody has the answer to that. That's all going to be pretty simple. And that will be the only formal action for the program that you need to take in 2024, right? Nothing else will need to happen besides wage detail reporting. But what you do need to be thinking about now are a couple of things. Remember, if you go back, and if you haven't watched it, you can go back, it's still out there, that our full 2.5-hour legislative series on this, when we go really far into the details, we talk about premiums. And remember, those premiums are what have to be paid in. The legislation says that it can be charged 50% of that premium can be paid by the employee. So employers have a choice. Employers will have to choose, are we going to pay the full premium, or are we going to charge 50% of that to employees? And the reason you want to be thinking about that now is that you do not want to make that as a knee-jerk reaction, and you want to have a clear understanding of how is that going to impact employees? What does that look like on their actual paycheck? Somebody should sit down and say, if I'm an employee making, what is our lowest pay that we pay somebody? What is the actual dollars and cents impact on their paycheck, to understand that? What's our communication around that going to be? And what is the rollout around that going to be? We just really want to talk about, again, that large banks of PTO and EIB. A lot of employers have left those out there saying, well, if somebody has a real chronic issue, we're going to allow them to have that, so that if they're out for short-term disability, they can supplement that 60%. Well, we're not going to have as much need for that. And understanding what that looks like, there will still be that 60% pay through the paid leave system. It's not going to be 100%. And again, that 2.5-hour webinar breaks down how they do that. So if you're not understanding how much they will get paid, there's a great resource out there for you. But first and foremost, if you have never, ever had to deal with FMLA before, you've never been in FMLA, which is that Federal Family Medical Leave Act coverage, and you've never had to handle leaves of absences before, you are going to have to deal with staffing issues. You are going to have people who have departments, operational managers who've never had to staff when they've had a leave of absence before. And like Leah said, the real challenge is going to be, you could be in a situation where you hire somebody and they're a new hire and they become eligible for paid Minnesota leave and could be gone for 12 weeks, but that's not covered under federal FMLA yet. So they have the Minnesota paid leave of 12 weeks, then they become eligible for federal leave, they could have up to 24 weeks of leave that's protected, job protected leave, which is a 24-week staffing issue. And so we really are saying, hey, outside of all the legislative things, you need to be thinking about operationally, how are you going to staff your positions? How are you going to staff your departments? Are you going to have some temp labor that's available? Are you going to have more cross training so people can work in different areas? Are you going to overstaff by one or have a part-time person that's going to flex up and be available if you have a leave of absence? There's a lot of different ways you could look at that, but that needs to be something that you're talking about and pulling in your operational leaders and managers with now to say, what is this going to look like? What are the challenges you're going to run into? Because the rest of it is purely administrative. It's all administrative on either the state side, the private insurance side, and then who's managing HR. But the real pain point is going to be seen in those operational staffing areas. And so don't forget that. Put that at the front of your mind and start talking about that now, because you can have a plan now and be ahead of that. So I know there's a lot. If you're putting the Q&A in there, Megan's still in there. I see her knocking down those numbers. Leah, I'll let you close us all out with what people can do if they're walking out of here. It's the middle of the day. They're not going to have a drink. They're going to have a cup of coffee. What can they think about and do from here?
Yeah. Hopefully today we left you at least equipped to know what you need to do next, right? And I know that a lot of people still have a lot of questions. There's still a lot of questions unanswered on things like Minnesota paid leave. So I think big takeaways, make sure you're prepared for FLSA, take a look at those salary thresholds, take a look at ESST. You can go back and fix and deal with any challenges you're having. Just do it carefully. And then as far as Minnesota paid family leave, we really need to keep our ear to the ground for both that ESST and what's coming on paid family leave. So stay informed, sign up for those newsletters, and then you'll have our contact information and all these slides. Reach out, make sure you have a resource that you can contact when you've got those kinds of questions. We did have some questions about the extended Minnesota paid family leave session that we put on last year. We'll make sure that link to that session is included with the slides when they come out as well. So you can go back and listen to that also. So thank you all so much for your time. Thanks for those of you that stuck around a little longer. That was like rapid fire. Man, we did it though. Okay. Yeah. Well, everybody have a great day. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.